Bathilda Bagshot. She has less than 10 minutes of screen time. She doesn't speak a coherent word whatsoever. When we see her, she's, well, we'll get into that. But conceptually, she is the greatest character in the entire Harry Potter franchise. In fact, I cannot even think about Bathilda without wanting to wrap myself in a blanket and close my blinds just in case she's standing outside. She is utterly terrifying, and when I say she's conceptually the greatest, trust me when I say why. But first, we're live on Patreon, so if you'd like to stay up to date, get credited, and have a direct say in more videos like these, you know what to do. Now for the points I'm going to make in this video to land, and I mean really land, where you truly get what I'm saying here, I've got to tell you a little story about me and how I even came to this opinion in the first place. You see, I wasn't a Harry Potter kid growing up. When everyone in my elementary school was reading about Hogwarts, I was reading and obsessing over Roald Dahl. It just wasn't a thing that ever piqued my interest. But several years later, I randomly came across a Screen Rant article which listed the scariest scenes in the Harry Potter film series. The most scary on the list? A scene in the, quote, 7th Harry Potter film where a seemingly sweet old woman turns into a snake. I didn't watch the film, I just kept that in mind and went about the next several years not thinking about it. After all, it was a random article, and again, I hadn't read any of the books or seen any of the movies at this point. Then last summer, I decided to watch the series. I had forgotten all about the article until I saw this. And when I did, I thought, wait. That's the snake. That's the snake lady. And if you know the truth of that scene, you'll know exactly the sheer level of context I was missing having not read the books. And by the way, it was like 4:30 in the morning at this point. Despite all this, I couldn't help but notice that something was seriously off about this chick.
You wanna get out of here?
And so I discovered the power of the wedding ring.
And I instinctively knew that there was more to this than the film was letting on. I even looked up a clip of the scene, which on YouTube was titled Fake Bathilda Scene, and finally decided to read the book version. Happy to see that I had an old copy of the Deathly Hallows, I opened it up, skimmed through the chapter Godric's Hollow, and once I managed through the vivid descriptions of Harry's parents decaying, I reached the following chapter, Bathilda's Secret. And it was here where I learned the truth. Through clues like her eyes thick with cataracts, smelling of rotten meat, and her house looking abandoned, it became clear that the Bathilda we see in this scene is not the genie in disguise using transfiguration, but Bathilda's literal corpse, possessed by and reanimated by the genie like a freaking puppet. And for months, I thought this was crazy. I thought this was so original. I raved about this scene to everybody I know. But what if I told you that this creepy little scene is nothing? What if I told you Bathilda's gruesome and exceptionally creative phenotypic presentation in the Deathly Hallows is only a minuscule piece of the greater puzzle as to why this character is all of Harry's inner turmoil and still resonates so deeply with me all this time later, after now seeing all the movies and reading all the books. You see, Bathilda, or Professor Bagshot rather, is first named in the Philosopher's Stone, as she appears on Harry's school shopping list for Hogwarts, having authored A History of Magic and many other textbooks. As a witch, she spent her life vigorously studying magical history and became great friends with Albus Dumbledore. But it wasn't always that way. You see, if we go way back, Bathilda lived in Godric's Hollow before the Dumbledore family, which means she was really freaking old, and happened to be the great aunt of Gellert Grindelwald. When the Dumbledore family finally moved in, following Albus's father's arrest, Bathilda tried making friends with Kendra, Albus's mother, but she was initially snubbed, so for the next several years, Bathilda and the Dumbledores didn't talk. It wasn't until a young Albus wrote a paper at Hogwarts that impressed Bagshot, subsequently marking the beginning of their friendship, that they'd become acquainted. Years later, Bathilda was actually the only one to attend Harry's first birthday party, which was just a little tea with his parents, but she absolutely loved Harry, and Lily recalled her dropping in all the time and being very sweet. And 16 years after that, following Dumbledore's passing, journalist Rita Skeeter, always salivating for a story, decided to write a touching little biography about him, kindly titled The Life and Lies of Albus Dumbledore, which brings us to the Deathly Hallows when Ron's Auntie Muriel reveals to Harry that the woman who spoke to Rita Skeeter was, of course, Bathilda. And it's during this precise interaction when we learn that Bathilda now has a reputation for being off her rocker, despite for years being known as the most celebrated magical historian of the last century. In the book, Muriel describes her as Gaga, and in the film, you can tell that the general consensus about Bathilda is that she's lost it, just in Muriel's demeanor when talking about her. Now, just in case you need a little refresher, Harry and Hermione travel to Godric's Hollow to search for Godric Gryffindor's sword, which had the ability to destroy Horcruxes, and Harry suspects Bathilda just might be the one to have it for them. They meet her in an uncanny state, follow her to her house, and the rest is history. Now, one of the things that many question about Bathilda's fate itself is whether she was killed by Voldemort or not. The only information the Deathly Hallows gives us is that she had been dead a while, and when Voldemort knew that Harry was on his way to Godric's Hollow, he had Nagini possess and reanimate her. As the great aunt of Gellert Grindelwald, who was born in 1883, Bathilda had to have been born sometime in the early to mid-19th century. And that leads me to Potter Watch. Potter Watch was essentially a pirated radio station that supporters of Harry and the Order could secretly tune into for updates and information regarding the Second Wizarding War. Following her death, Potter Watch implied that Bathilda was murdered, but unbeknownst to them, they did not report her death from the place she initially died. Instead, Bathilda was discovered months after the incident with Harry and Hermione, when her body was found in its post-snake eruption condition. Given that nobody besides Harry and Hermione were aware of what actually went down that Christmas Eve, it makes sense that Bathilda's cause of death was ruled as a murder with, quote, unmistakable signs of injuries inflicted by dark magic. The only thing is, she'd already been gone before those injuries occurred from the genie shooting out of her neck. And we know this because of how fast she begins to decay once Nagini begins breaking out of her body. Being well over 100, it's likely she simply passed from old age and had been gone a while, especially considering how dilapidated her house was. And when Voldemort knew Harry was on his way to Godric's Hollow, he sent Nagini to reanimate her, which is why it's much more probable to say Bathilda Bagshot was not murdered. As gruesome and horrifying as this whole thing is, I found myself feeling sad for Bathilda. First off, think of how creepy it is. What would Bathilda think? We know she was a nice woman. Imagine how horrified she would be if she knew her literal corpse was reanimated and made a puppet for the benefit of Voldemort. I honestly think the shot of her in the cemetery in the scene before is even more depressing, because that's where she should be. Think about it. It's unlikely Bathilda ever thought that after she'd pass, after she'd begin her rest, that one day, after being long dead, she'd quite literally get up, and completely without her knowledge whatsoever. Which leads me to my final point. I want you to think about Harry for a moment. There's so much he knows about his parents, but he never knew his parents. He was close to Dumbledore, but Bathilda knew so many things about him that Harry did not. And despite those things being known, those things are gone. Kind of like Bathilda. She knew Dumbledore. She knew Harry's parents. She's physically right in front of him, but there's nothing behind those eyes. Forget even the scene of him looking at his parents' grave, because despite this being the glaringly obvious portrayal of his grief, Bathilda is Harry's loss personified. She was the only person in Godric's Hollow who knew his parents and Dumbledore, and there she is, right in front of him. He knows of her. She held many stories which I assume Harry would have loved to hear, but she's not there. Bathilda Bagshot is not only conceptually terrifying, she's conceptually really sad. And the fact that there's all of this preparation, all of these emotions stuffed into a character we see for 5 minutes is absolutely astounding. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments, and once again, don't forget to become a patron over at Patreon so you can stay up to date and have a direct say in more videos like these. Just don't forget, we're too old to care about this stuff anyways.